Hi, and welcome to InstaVision. I'm floating around in the center of the universe here in Knoxville, Tennessee, and today I'm joined by one of my favorite science fiction writers, Steve Stirling, who's the author of such major works as Dies the Fire and Island in the Sea of Times, and an endless array of other novels of really great accomplishment and distinction. Thanks for joining us, Steve. It's really great to have you here.
My pleasure. First time I've ever used one of these things.
Well, you know, it's funny how many science fiction writers aren't actually on the cutting edge of current technology. It's one of those sort of funny things.
Well, you know, ask me a question about steam engines and I'm your guy.
Well, actually, that's sort of the interesting thing. You've got the Change series here, and you've got sort of two halves of it. In the first half, which starts with Island in the Sea of Time and goes on through successor volumes, the island of Nantucket gets sent mysteriously back into the Bronze Age, and all of its inhabitants have to survive dealing with Babylonians and Hittites and assorted other ne'er-do-wells and do-wells and such, and adapt modern technology and sort of really more 19th century technology to a very different kind of world. And then the flip side is, in the other half, the Emberverse series they call it, starting with Dies the Fire and continuing on with the other volumes in that, we found out what happens to the world that was left behind. And there, basically, all the machines just quit working, and we're left with nothing more complicated than a grandfather clock or a crossbow. And we have sort of a quasi-medieval world. In both cases, it's really sort of, you know, it's science fiction, people would call it, but most of the people involved are like shooting longbows and stuff. What brought you to that place in your work?
Partially, it's just what wells up out of your subconscious. There's an old joke in the field that we get our ideas from a mail order house in Poughkeepsie, but really they just occur to us. The other thing is, of course, that writing this sort of time travel and alternate worlds science fiction spares you the humiliation of trying to predict the immediate future and being so spectacularly and obviously wrong in retrospect. The science fiction authors used to be a bit bolder about that. They'd write up things 5 or 10 or 20 years in the future, and then 5 or 10 or 20 years later they'd look like complete idiots. Nowadays it's considered much safer either to go into an alternate universe where you can essentially act as God yourself and can't be shown up by the real world, or set things very, very, very far in the future, which also spares you the trouble of trying to predict the immediate future. The fact of the matter is that science fiction authors are no better than professional futurists about predicting what's going to happen 5 or 10 years from now, and professional futurists are absolutely lousy at it. If we could really predict the future, we'd all be immensely wealthy.
Well, that's something devoutly to be wished, I suppose, but it's not working for me either. Well, you know, I talked to John Scalzi a while back, and he said there sort of seems to be a fad for apocalyptic science fiction right now, and suggested that your Change series was really what sort of kicked it off. Do you think there's something in the zeitgeist culturally that makes this appeal to people? Is it something like a sense of the fragility of our technological civilization, or the fact that most people don't really know what's kind of behind the front of the machine and how it works, or what do you think drives that?
I think it may be an aspect of that. For most of human history, people have lived in an environment which was like uncontrollable and often did terrible things to you, but which in its immediate features readily comprehensible. When everyone was a peasant, everyone knew what being a peasant was about and how to do it. Of course, every so often it failed and you starved to death, but at least you did so without like excessive cognitive dissonance. These days, most people just don't have the slightest idea of how the basic technologies we depend upon function. And it does tend to produce a certain anxiety, and also, of course, a certain degree of paranoia. And I think also that the web tends to promote paranoia of that sort too. You know, not only conspiracy theories, but oh, you've got the electric universe people. There's a sect that's convinced that there's 1,000 years has been inserted into history and doesn't really belong there. You name it, they're out there. And unfortunately, along with all its good effects, the web brings together people who should be isolated and gives a voice to those who really should remain voiceless.
An army of idiots. Yes, well, that does happen. Now, one thing I notice in these apocalyptic novels is they're almost like an excuse to return to the Robert Heinlein sort of competent man hero instead of the kind of emo anti-hero we saw for a while. And do you think that also kind of registers with some more general desire to people actually want to deal with people who know what they're doing?
Well, we all have so much experience with the other type. The thing about an apocalypse is, especially if most people get killed off, is that the people who survive are first going to be very lucky, and second, going to be highly skilled in possibly recondite ways that are relevant to their situation. I've had complaints about the Change series that the protagonists seem to have a lot of luck and to meet a large number of people with the skills they really need. I have to simply point out that in a situation where 99% of the population dies, everybody who survives is a Powerball winner. So of course they're going to be there because of an unlikely series of accidents. But then if you look at every human being's personal history, that's the way it is. Like, I'm here because, well, let's see, my grandfather was gassed on the Western Front at 3rd Ypres, Passchendaele in 1917. He met my grandmother, who was a volunteer auxiliary detachment nurse while he was convalescing. In England, they would never have met socially before the war, or if the war hadn't happened, because they were like 3 degrees apart in social status. They met, they fell in love, they eloped. One of the reasons she became a VAD was because she was bombed by a Zeppelin in London. This is a fantastic series of coincidences. My father's mother, that was my maternal grandparents, my father's mother was on her way from England to Boston to get a job in 1912 when her ship hit an iceberg. And all the people on the ship were rescued, but they were taken to St. John's, Newfoundland, and that's where she met my father's father. So I'm standing here before you, a quasi-famous science fiction author, because of a whole series of unlikely climatological and military and political circumstances. It's a fantastic series of accidents, and if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't exist. And I think pretty well everybody can say the same thing.
Yeah, that reminds me of something Neil's... I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say I'm also here because my father could talk a snake out of his skin. In 1942, he went to a party in Halifax, Nova Scotia. My mother was there with someone else who he knew. We'll call him Sam for convenience. Sam went to the washroom. My father walked up to her table and said, "Sam wasn't feeling well and he had to leave, but he asked me to walk you home." A month later, they were married.
Wow. So
and to talk about
that must be where you get your talent. Yeah. That's funny. Your talent for tales is clearly genetic there. Well, you know, the other thing that strikes me about your work compared to older science fiction is that you actually have a lot of economics in there. You actually sort of worry about how these quasi-medieval worlds work. And if you read older science fiction that sort of tries a similar approach, like, you know, the famous Lord Kelvin of Otherwin and such, they don't pay that much attention to that. Is this because science fiction writers are smarter now, or because they figure their readers are smarter and can follow this stuff?
Well, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Commercial science fiction has ancient roots, but it's, as a genre, it really started in the 1920s, within living memory, or almost within living memory. Jack Williamson, a classic science fiction writer who's been one of my inspirations, who lived here in New Mexico, came here in a covered wagon and sold his first story to Hugo Gernsback in the 1920s. So we learn. Actually, the one you mentioned, Lord Kelvin of Otherwin, Piper was paid more attention to that sort of thing than most of the science fiction authors of his generation. But they were coming from a slightly different place, and they were a little closer to the pulp field. If you wanted to name an example of one that didn't often pay a lot of attention to it, you'd say take Robert E. Howard, you know, the author of the Conan stories, which are actually quite good if you avoid the pastiche later written under using the same characters but by other people. But he was given to having like giant lost cities in a desert or a jungle. Usually they look like a green jade pentagon, and referring to the building in Washington, and they'd just be in a desert. And you'd be reading through about the adventures and the hack and slash and the intrigues and all this sort of thing, and suddenly you'd wonder, what are all these people eating? You know, so I always like to get the underpinnings right. Of course, you've got to be careful not to put too much of that in the story, because story is about characters, conflict, and what they do. It's not a textbook on economic geography. when I was writing my first book, I did so much research that I eventually had the entire floor of my apartment covered by a gigantic map, and hand-drawn. And I found myself crawling around making notes on where the caravans were carrying flax from. And at that point, I said to myself, Steve, stop researching, start writing. And I try to keep it under control. It's easier to cut than to put in.
Yes, indeed. I've learned that myself. Now, in post-change America, we get sort of a medieval revival, but it's not really like the Middle Ages because, of course, we have what's left of the pre-existing knowledge base. It's a semi-medieval world, but with people who, remember how to build steam engines, even if they don't work, and make Monty Python jokes. That's sort of an interesting place to start. You have a lot of fun with the remnants of culture that sort of percolate around in that world. Yes.
At one point, they're going through a city. The protagonists are going through a city. I think it was in a meeting at Corvallis. And they pass a graffiti on a wall. Someone's written, "Help, I've fallen into the Ren Fair and I can't get out." Civilization might fall, but the people wouldn't be medieval people. And of course, even if people are trying to recreate the past, they don't really recreate the past. People have tried to do this throughout history. When the Puritans came to America, they were trying to create what they called a Bible Commonwealth, a recreation of the ways of the early Christians, or in the case of the more linear of them, ancient Israel. And what they made was something new, something heavily based on English traditions, and something based on their theories and stories and myths about the past, rather than actually about the past. In the Change series, historical recreationists, SCA people, ARMA people, Ren Fair types, survivalists, have a disproportionate influence because they're sort of mentally prepared to a certain extent when things go completely crazy. As one of them puts it, when the going gets weird, the weird get going. But what they create isn't, in any sense, a recreation of the past. It's a new world based on ideas about the past and also on, of course, on the physical constraints they're stuck with. I think at one point there's a knight whose father was a Hell's Angel, and his arms are Gyrony, Or, and Sable, a Harley Purpure.
I love it. I love it. And one of your big villains is a professor. That's, I don't know, that's a little troubling to me, but probably accurate, as anyone who's been to a faculty meeting could attest. I've actually noticed, I'm not an SCA or Renaissance Fair guy myself, really, but I know a number of those people. And your work seems to be pretty popular with them. Do you get a lot of feedback on that?
A fair bit. I didn't actually intend it as fan service. I only started researching that subcultural milieu intensively when I got the idea for the book, but I've been in contact with a lot of them. One of the things I do to try to get stuff right is when I'm writing about people or circumstances which I'm not personally familiar with, I try to, and there are people who are familiar with it, unless it's, like completely made up or aliens from another planet or something of that nature. I run it past people who do have personal experience. I've got a number of first readers, and say if I'm dealing with, say, SCA types or Wiccans who have a broad overlap, by the way, I run it past them first to make sure I'm not making any obvious mistakes. World building in the science fictional sense is good occupational therapy for lunatics who think they're God. Something's always going to come up and bite you on the butt. And more often than not, it's not what you don't know, it's what you think you know that isn't so. And getting people who really know a particular milieu is useful because they catch the obvious stuff that you thought you knew but don't.
Well last question. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, for example, the main reason that people lived shorter lives in the old days was not that they lacked high-tech medical technology. It was just they didn't know about germs. Most of the drop in mortality between, what you might call the old days and modern times came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was just because of public hygiene. People started to know about germs, and they avoided infection, and mortality dropped like a rock. All the advances since, even with antibiotics, haven't been nearly as significant as that.
Well, that's absolutely right. And actually, there's a great book by Robert Fogel called The Escape from Hunger and Premature Death that's really about that. And
I've read that.
Really drives it home. So last question, your next book is A Taint in the Blood. What's that about?
Well, that's a completely new departure for me. It's an urban quasi-fantasy. Actually, the fantastic elements have scientific underpinnings. I have a scientist from Los Alamos among my writers group, so that helps with getting that stuff. When I use the bafflegab, I can at least use moderately plausible bafflegab. But it's about a secret group of people who are the source of all our legends about supernatural creatures. They actually have mental abilities which enable them to manipulate probability on a quantum level. And they're around and they're running things, which is one reason why things are so screwed up, because they're really not very nice people. It starts in Santa Fe and moves out from there to California. And it's the first time I've used an actual contemporary setting for some time, and had a lot of fun with that.
Oh, that's great. Well, you know, the notion that we're controlled by an evil conspiracy would explain a lot, though if it were a competent evil conspiracy, I can only hope that things would run more smoothly and sensibly somehow. But thank you so much anyway for taking the time to join us, and I really appreciate you talking about your work in science fiction.
Thanks. It was fun.
And you can check out more on Steve Stirling's work at his website, smstirling.com. That's smstirling.com, the official SM Stirling webpage. And thank you for tuning in or clicking in or whatever to InstaVision, and we'll be back soon. Thanks again.